What if we told you that, despite America's frequent claims of championing human rights, it remains an unwelcoming place for many black people? Would this surprise you? If you're a black American, you likely won't be shocked. You've probably already encountered challenges that go unnoticed by the mainstream media. From securing loans to owning property, racial disparities are still embedded in everyday life in the U.S. But why? Was America ever truly designed for black people to thrive, or has it always been a place where whiteness determines freedom? What led to this? And how does the subtle racism of today perpetuate these inequalities? Let's dive into the complex layers of America's history to uncover the truth. The grim reality of America's racial history. America's history with race is painful and deeply rooted in discrimination. From the brutal era of slavery to the long enforcement of Jim Crow laws and the enduring racial disparities seen today, the treatment of black Americans reflects an ongoing struggle against systemic racism. The archives of black history tell us that for centuries, black people in America have faced obstacles that go beyond individual prejudices. They are embedded in the very structure of the nation. A nation built on contradiction. To understand this better, we need to examine America's founding ideals and the stark contrast with its actions. The United States was built on promises of liberty, justice, and equality. Yet, these promises were never intended for everyone. At its inception, the Founding Fathers, while advocating for freedom from tyranny, largely supported the institution of slavery. This contradiction, talking about liberty while perpetuating oppression, was woven into the fabric of American society from the start. Slavery, America's original sin. The institution of slavery in the United States reveals this dark reality. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, millions of black people were forcibly taken from Africa, stripped of their humanity, and treated as property. They endured unimaginable suffering, forced labor, physical abuse, and the denial of basic rights. Enslaved black people were seen as economic tools rather than human beings. This dehumanization left a profound and lasting impact on American society. The legacy of white supremacy. When the United States declared independence in 1776, the belief in white supremacy was deeply ingrained in its societal and legal structures. Black people were not considered part of the We the People outlined in the U.S. Constitution. This foundation of inequality paved the way for centuries of racial discrimination. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but this did not mean freedom in practice. Instead, new forms of oppression emerged, including sharecropping, segregation, and discriminatory laws, commonly known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation in public spaces, education, housing, and employment, ensuring that black people remained second-class citizens. These laws persisted well into the 20th century and were enforced through intimidation, violence, and institutional power. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s brought significant progress, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantling many legal forms of discrimination. But despite these advancements, the remnants of systemic racism continue to affect black communities today. The silent racism of today, while explicit segregation is no longer legal, more subtle forms of racism still permeate American life. Discrimination in the criminal justice system, housing, healthcare, and education disproportionately affects black Americans. For instance, black Americans are incarcerated at significantly higher rates than their white counterparts for similar offenses. In housing, redlining practices, where black people were systematically denied mortgages in certain neighborhoods, have left long-lasting effects, contributing to the racial wealth gap that persists today. This silent racism also extends to economic disparities. Black entrepreneurs often face higher interest rates on loans, limited access to capital, and more obstacles in building wealth. Meanwhile, the American media often fails to highlight these systemic issues, focusing instead on individual successes, which can obscure the broader struggles of black communities. The question then arises: what is America trying to achieve by ignoring these persistent inequities? A call for change. America's history reveals a long-standing pattern of racial inequality, but this doesn't mean change is impossible. By acknowledging this legacy, we can better understand how to address the systemic challenges that continue to affect Black Americans. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has brought renewed attention to issues like police brutality, racial profiling, and economic injustice. These conversations, however uncomfortable, are necessary for the nation to live up to its promise of liberty and justice for all. In conclusion, it's clear that America's journey toward racial equality remains incomplete. The history of Black people in America is one of resilience, resistance, and hope, but it is also a history marred by oppression. The United States must continue to confront its past honestly to create a more just future for everyone. The legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, dehumanizing history of systemic racism. The institution of slavery in the United States was not only a dehumanizing practice, but also a profound violation of the most basic human rights. Black individuals were forcibly stripped of their freedom, reduced to commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited. Families were torn apart, with parents and children separated without any regard for their emotional bonds. These individuals endured harsh physical labor under brutal conditions and were subjected to severe emotional and physical abuse, leaving deep scars that would span generations. This dark chapter in American history is not confined to the past. The impact of slavery has left a lasting imprint on the nation, laying the foundation for systemic racial disparities that persist in various forms even today. The abolition of slavery in 1865, while a significant step toward justice, did not mark the end of racial inequality in the United States. Instead, it introduced a new era of institutionalized discrimination through segregation, discriminatory laws, and enduring biases that continued to disadvantage Black Americans. The enduring impact of slavery. Even after the abolition of slavery, Black individuals faced numerous challenges in accessing the same rights and opportunities as their white counterparts. Educational institutions, employment opportunities, housing, and healthcare systems all reflected the racial hierarchy established during slavery. These barriers created a cycle of disadvantage, preventing Black Americans from fully participating in economic and social life. This legacy of racial inequality is evident today in the ongoing disparities Black Americans face. Discrimination in education, criminal justice, and economic opportunities continues to affect their lives, contributing to a persistent wealth gap, higher rates of unemployment, and significant disparities in health outcomes. The story of Black America is one of resilience in the face of systemic adversity, but it is also a story of ongoing struggle for equal opportunity and recognition. Jim Crow laws, institutionalizing racism. If the abolition of slavery was the first step in America's slow march toward racial equality, the introduction of Jim Crow laws in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was a massive step backward. These laws, enforced primarily in the southern states, were designed to maintain the racial hierarchy established during slavery. They mandated racial segregation in nearly every aspect of public life: schools, public transportation, restaurants, restrooms, and even water fountains were divided along racial lines. Black Americans were systematically excluded from the rights and privileges that were enjoyed by white Americans, including access to quality education, economic opportunities, and political participation. The implementation of these laws created a deeply divided society, where white Americans were favored and Black Americans were marginalized and oppressed. The Jim Crow era was marked by violent enforcement of these laws. Black individuals who challenged the status quo faced intimidation, violence, and even lynching. The message was clear: Black Americans were not welcome to share in the rights and freedoms that white Americans took for granted. This period solidified the racial disparities that had begun during slavery, entrenching inequality further into the fabric of American society. The fight for civil rights. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s sought to dismantle the systemic racism enshrined by Jim Crow laws. Activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and many others risked their lives to challenge these discriminatory practices. The passage of landmark legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, marked a turning point in the fight for racial equality, outlawing many forms of racial segregation and discrimination. Yet, while these laws were pivotal, they did not erase the centuries of harm caused by slavery and Jim Crow. The systemic racism that Black Americans have endured for generations cannot be undone with legislation alone. The effects of these historical injustices continue to manifest in modern society through economic inequality, disparities in the justice system, and the ongoing struggle for true racial equality. Building a community and creating change. As we reflect on these important issues, we want to thank you for supporting our channel. Your likes, subscriptions, and engagement help us continue to produce content that uncovers the untold stories of history. By joining us on this journey, you're helping build a community dedicated to education, awareness, and change. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video to support our mission. Together, we can shine a light on the overlooked chapters of history and contribute to a better understanding of the world we live in today. The road ahead. Understanding America's history of racial inequality is key to addressing the challenges that Black Americans continue to face today. The remnants of slavery and Jim Crow still influence modern society as systemic racism takes new forms. Whether it's unequal access to education, disparities in the criminal justice system, or the racial wealth gap, the impact of this dark history remains. Yet there is hope. Movements for racial justice, such as Black Lives Matter, have brought renewed attention to these issues. By acknowledging the past and working toward meaningful reform, America can begin to heal from the wounds inflicted by centuries of inequality. This is not just a Black struggle. It is an American struggle, a fight for the soul of a nation that promises liberty and justice for all, but has not yet fully delivered on that promise. The legacy of Jim Crow, systemic segregation, and the long road to racial equality. The pervasive nature of Jim Crow laws reinforce the belief that America was built to prioritize the needs and privileges of white people, deepening racial divisions and institutionalizing inequality. These laws, which were enacted in the late 19th century and remained in force until the mid-20th century, represented a series of legal measures that cemented racial segregation in nearly every facet of daily life. From schools to public transportation and even drinking fountains, Jim Crow laws ensured that Black Americans were physically separated from white Americans under the guise of separate but equal. However, the notion of separate but equal was far from the truth. The facilities designated for Black Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded, a stark contrast to the well-maintained, adequately resourced spaces reserved for whites. Schools for Black children were overcrowded and under-resourced. Transportation options were limited, and public spaces like parks, libraries, and restaurants offered substandard accommodations for Black patrons. Even the simple act of drinking water was segregated, with Black Americans often relegated to using poorly maintained water fountains, while whites enjoyed clean, well-kept facilities. The Jim Crow era's systematic segregation extended far beyond physical spaces. It shaped the social, economic, and psychological landscapes for generations of Black Americans. Segregation reinforced harmful stereotypes, fostering the belief that Black individuals were inherently inferior to whites. This not only affected Black people's access to quality education, jobs, and housing, but also perpetuated a sense of exclusion and marginalization that has had long-lasting effects on the collective psyche of Black communities. These laws were more than just legal restrictions. They were the embodiment of institutionalized racism, reinforcing the deeply ingrained notion that America was a country designed to cater exclusively to the needs of white people. By creating separate spheres for whites and Blacks, Jim Crow laws maintained the racial hierarchy that had been established during slavery, further entrenching systemic racism in every corner of American life. The inequalities that resulted from Jim Crow laws were not confined to the period in which they were enforced. The lack of access to quality education, decent housing, and fair employment opportunities created a cycle of poverty and disadvantage for many Black Americans, a cycle that continues to affect Black communities today. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought an end to legal segregation, with landmark victories such as the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954 and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These milestones were crucial in dismantling the institutional framework of segregation, but they did not eradicate the deep-seated racism that had become embedded in American society. Legal victories alone were not enough to reverse the generations of harm caused by slavery, Jim Crow, and the systemic racism that followed. As we look at the present-day realities, the question arises, is America now livable for Black people? While legal segregation may have been abolished, the quest for true racial equality remains an ongoing struggle. Black individuals in America today continue to face pervasive racial disparities that affect nearly every aspect of their lives, reflecting the enduring impact of historical injustices. One of the most glaring disparities that Black Americans contend with today is economic inequality. Despite the progress made through civil rights legislation, Black individuals still experience higher rates of poverty and unemployment compared to their white counterparts. This disparity is rooted in a long history of systemic denial of economic opportunities, which began with slavery and continued through redlining, discriminatory hiring practices, and wage gaps. Redlining, a practice in which Black Americans were denied mortgages or loans to purchase homes in certain neighborhoods, has left a legacy of economic segregation that continues to shape the landscape of Black communities today. This lack of access to affordable housing and economic mobility has contributed to the racial wealth gap, making it harder for Black families to build and pass down generational wealth. Another stark reminder of ongoing racial disparities is the criminal justice system. Black Americans are disproportionately affected by mass incarceration, facing higher rates of imprisonment and receiving harsher sentences compared to white Americans for similar offenses. The war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, and biased policing practices have all contributed to the overrepresentation of Black individuals in the prison system. Once incarcerated, Black individuals often face significant barriers to reintegration into society, including difficulty finding employment, housing, and access to voting rights. These systemic obstacles create a cycle of recidivism, trapping many Black Americans in a cycle of poverty and incarceration. Although the legal segregation of schools ended with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Black students continue to face significant educational disparities. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods are often underfunded and lack the resources necessary to provide a high-quality education. This inequity, combined with racial bias in school discipline, has contributed to lower graduation rates and limited access to higher education for Black students. The education gap further limits economic opportunities for Black Americans, perpetuating the cycle of poverty that began with the systemic exclusion of Black people from quality education during the Jim Crow era. While America has made significant strides toward racial equality, it is clear that the work is far from complete. The legacy of slavery and Jim Crow continues to cast a long shadow over Black communities, manifesting in ongoing disparities in wealth, education, healthcare, and criminal justice. The fight for racial justice is an ongoing challenge, requiring not only legal reforms but also a societal commitment to confronting and dismantling systemic racism in all its forms. As we continue to examine these critical issues, we invite you to support our mission by subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and joining our growing community. Together, we can work to create a better, more equitable future by learning from the past and advocating for meaningful change. The issues faced by Black Americans today extend far beyond individual acts of racism, revealing deep-rooted systemic biases within law enforcement, the legal system, healthcare, and housing. These systemic disparities disproportionately affect Black communities, creating a web of inequality that is difficult to escape. One of the most glaring examples is the criminal justice system, where Black Americans are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and receive harsher sentences than their white counterparts for similar offenses. This issue highlights a broader problem. Racial bias is not only present in individual cases, but is entrenched in the very institutions meant to serve justice. Health inequalities. a legacy of racism, the health disparities affecting Black Americans, are another consequence of this systemic inequality. Historical racism has cast a long shadow on the health of Black individuals, contributing to higher rates of chronic diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease, as well as shorter life expectancies. Limited access to quality health care exacerbates these issues, as Black communities often live in areas with fewer healthcare facilities, making it difficult to receive timely medical attention. Moreover, the stress of living under systemic racism, manifesting through social and economic disparities, has a direct impact on physical and mental health, compounding these challenges. For example, Black women in the U.S. are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women, a statistic that underscores the persistent racial disparities in healthcare access and treatment. Environmental factors, such as living in areas with higher levels of pollution, further compound these health issues, as Black communities are more likely to be located near toxic industries and environmental hazards. Housing and environmental justice stand out as critical issues that continue to profoundly impact Black communities. Discriminatory practices, including redlining and housing segregation, have left lasting disparities in living conditions. Redlining, where banks and other financial institutions denied loans or insurance to certain neighborhoods based on racial demographics, played a pivotal role in shaping the landscape of housing opportunities. This practice, which persisted for decades, restricted access to quality housing, locking Black families into neighborhoods with fewer resources, lower property values, and substandard living conditions. Even though redlining was officially outlawed in the 1960s, its effects are still felt today. Many Black neighborhoods continue to experience disinvestment, limiting access to safe housing, good schools, and economic opportunities. Housing segregation has created a ripple effect, where Black communities are often left behind in terms of infrastructure development, further widening the wealth gap between Black and white Americans. Environmental justice is closely tied to these housing inequalities. Black communities are disproportionately affected by environmental hazards, such as pollution, toxic waste sites, and industrial facilities that release harmful chemicals into the air and water. This unequal distribution of environmental risks has resulted in higher rates of asthma, lead poisoning, and other health conditions in Black neighborhoods. Furthermore, access to clean air, safe drinking water, and green spaces, essential components of a healthy living environment, are often limited in these communities. For instance, Flint, Michigan, serves as a tragic example of environmental injustice. The water crisis that disproportionately affected the city's Black population, who were exposed to lead-contaminated water, exemplifies how systemic neglect of Black communities leads to devastating health consequences. While significant strides have been made since the civil rights movement, many argue that the condition of Black people in America is still far from equitable. Although legal segregation has been dismantled, the legacy of racial discrimination persists in various aspects of everyday life. For those who believe that the situation for Black Americans has improved dramatically, it's crucial to examine ongoing issues that continue to plague Black communities. In recent years, there have been numerous disturbing incidents that expose the persistent issue of racism in America. Black individuals still face racist attacks, both verbal and physical, in their daily lives, and the unfair treatment they encounter is particularly evident in their interactions with law enforcement and the financial sector. For example, Black applicants for loans and mortgages continue to be disproportionately denied or given less favorable terms than their white counterparts, even when their financial profiles are similar. Moreover, high-profile incidents involving police brutality, such as the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others, have brought renewed attention to the systemic racism embedded in the criminal justice system. These cases highlight how Black individuals are often treated as threats, facing excessive force and harsher treatment than white Americans in similar situations. The Black Lives Matter movement has been instrumental in shedding light on these issues, advocating for police reform and greater accountability. The role of legal cases in addressing systemic racism. Throughout history, landmark legal cases have played a crucial role in challenging systemic racism and advancing the cause of racial equality in America. Cases like Cooper v. Aaron 1958 reaffirmed the federal government's authority to enforce school desegregation, while Regents of the University of California v. Bakke 1978 addressed the issue of racial quotas in college admissions, shaping the debate over affirmative action. Similarly, Smith v. Allwright 1944 was a pivotal case in dismantling racially discriminatory voting practices, ruling that it was unconstitutional for political parties to exclude black voters from primary elections. These legal victories were essential in pushing back against institutionalized racism, but they did not fully resolve the inequalities that continue to affect Black Americans today. The intersectionality of racial and environmental justice highlights the urgent need for comprehensive solutions that address both social and environmental inequalities. Acknowledging the historical practices of redlining, housing segregation, and environmental neglect is a crucial first step. However, meaningful progress will require more than recognition. It demands systemic change. Efforts to promote fair housing policies, improve access to healthcare, and address the environmental hazards disproportionately affecting Black communities are essential in closing the gap between Black and white Americans. Policies that promote environmental justice, such as the Environmental Justice for All Act, aim to tackle these issues by ensuring that no community bears an unfair share of environmental harm. The enduring struggles of Black Americans in the areas of housing, healthcare, and criminal justice are a reminder that racial equality is an ongoing journey. While legal reforms have been instrumental in challenging discriminatory practices, much more needs to be done to dismantle the systemic racism that continues to shape the lives of Black individuals in the United States. It is crucial for all of us to recognize the interwoven nature of racial and environmental justice, and to advocate for policies that promote fairness, equity, and opportunity for all. The legal battles fought throughout American history underscore the lasting impact of racism on Black Americans and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Landmark cases and movements have brought important national conversations to the forefront, but recent instances of police brutality, most notably the tragic killing of George Floyd, have reignited those discussions, shining a stark light on the systemic racism deeply embedded in law enforcement and beyond. George Floyd's death, along with other high-profile cases of police violence, sparked nationwide protests and highlighted the urgent need for policing reforms. The incident became a tipping point, forcing the country to confront long-standing issues regarding the treatment of Black individuals by law enforcement. While many celebrated the guilty verdict in Floyd's case as a step toward accountability, it also underscored the broader issue that these cases are far too common, and systemic change is necessary to ensure fair and equal treatment for all citizens, regardless of race. America's history is marred by a deeply rooted issue of racial injustice that has permeated the nation's fabric for centuries. The ideals of liberty and justice for all, promises enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, have remained elusive for Black individuals who have faced systemic barriers at every turn. From the grim legacy of slavery to the harsh enforcement of Jim Crow laws and persistent racial discrimination, the challenges faced by Black Americans have been both deeply ingrained and long-lasting. Slavery, as one of the darkest chapters in American history, set the stage for centuries of racial inequality. Even after slavery was abolished, Black Americans continued to face oppression through segregation, disenfranchisement, and economic exclusion. Jim Crow laws institutionalized this racial inequality, enforcing segregation in nearly every aspect of life and creating separate, inferior facilities for Black Americans. These laws, combined with discriminatory practices like redlining, have left a lasting impact on Black communities, shaping a legacy of systemic racism that is still felt today. Despite significant strides made during the civil rights movement, the reality for many Black Americans today reflects a country still grappling with racial disparities. These inequalities are pervasive, impacting every aspect of life, from economic opportunities and housing to healthcare, criminal justice, and the environment. The roots of these disparities lie in historical injustices, which continue to shape the landscape for Black communities. Economic inequality, for example, remains a significant challenge. Black Americans experience higher rates of poverty and unemployment compared to their white counterparts. This is a result of historical barriers, such as exclusion from wealth-building opportunities, discriminatory hiring practices, and redlining. As a result, the racial wealth gap persists, making it more difficult for Black families to achieve financial stability and economic mobility. In the realm of criminal justice, Black Americans are disproportionately affected by mass incarceration and harsher sentencing. They are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and face longer prison sentences for the same offenses as their white counterparts. This is not just a reflection of individual prejudices, but of systemic biases within the legal system that have been built up over generations. The war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentencing, and over-policing in Black communities have all contributed to this disparity, perpetuating a cycle of incarceration and poverty. Healthcare disparities also remain a critical issue. Black Americans suffer from higher rates of chronic diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease, and they often have less access to quality healthcare. Environmental injustices further exacerbate these health disparities, as Black communities are more likely to live near toxic industries and in areas with poor air and water quality. This unequal distribution of environmental burdens has resulted in higher rates of asthma, lead poisoning, and other health issues. Housing segregation, another legacy of redlining and discriminatory practices, continues to affect Black communities today. Many Black Americans still live in neighborhoods that were historically denied investment, resulting in underfunded schools, poor infrastructure, and limited access to economic opportunities. These conditions not only perpetuate the racial wealth gap, but also contribute to long-term social and economic inequalities. As these realities show, America is still struggling with the deep-seated inequalities that have defined much of its history. For Black Americans, the question remains, is America good enough for you? Where do you believe inequality in America is rooted, and who is responsible for perpetuating it? These are important questions that spark ongoing conversations about what needs to change in order to create a more equitable society for all. As we reflect on the enduring struggles of Black Americans, it's clear that while progress has been made, there is still a long way to go. Racism, both in its overt and systemic forms, continues to impact the lives of Black individuals across the country. So, can America ever truly free itself from the legacy of racism? The answer depends on the collective will of the nation to address these deep-rooted inequalities and work toward meaningful, systemic change. If you've made it this far, we invite you to join the conversation. Share your thoughts on where inequality in America stems from and what you think can be done to address it. Let us know in the comments below. Your voice is important in this dialogue. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please support us by subscribing, clicking the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. We're committed to bringing you thought-provoking discussions on the issues that matter most. And with your support, we can continue to build a strong community of individuals dedicated to education and change.